It all began on a sunny spring morning, when the dew still embraced the leaves and the bird songs announced the arrival of a new day in the quiet neighborhood of Eternal Roses. For most residents, life followed a predictable routine, rushing to work on time, sharing coffees on the sidewalks, and spending weekends tending to meticulously trimmed gardens. But at my house, located at the far north of the neighborhood, something unusual was about to change the course of history. My name is Rafael Morales, a passionate botanist in every sense of the word. For years, my love for flora had led me to cultivate an extensive collection of exotic plants in my garden, a vibrant oasis amid the almost rigid order imposed by the Board of Directors of the Homeowners Association, HOA, of Eternal Roses. Unlike most residents who adhered strictly to every rule and regulation, I saw in my plants a form of expression and freedom, a tribute to diversity and natural beauty. That morning, however, my passion transformed into a bureaucratic nightmare. As I descended the stairs with a cup of coffee in hand, I noticed something unusual on the front door, an amber envelope sealed with the HOA's official insignia. With a racing heart, I opened it and read the first lines that would change my life. Pursuant to the disposition of the Committee on Aesthetics and Conservation, Mr. Rafael Morales is hereby notified that he has violated the association's rules by maintaining an excessive number of exotic plants which disturb the traditional image and harmony of the neighborhood. A fine of $750 is imposed for the violation of the established regulations. I felt as if an icy hand had run down my back. Excessive exotic plants? How could it be that my beloved garden, my sanctuary of colors and fragrances, was considered a threat to the harmony of the neighborhood? In that very moment, a mixture of indignation and confusion took hold of me. I had spent years nurturing every corner of my garden, selecting species that were, in many cases, rare in the region, but always with the aim of beautifying and enriching the biodiversity of the area. Determined not to let an arbitrary fine tarnish my passion, I made my way to the central office of the HOA. Along the way, as I strolled along the immaculate sidewalks of Eternal Roses, I recalled the many encounters at the association meetings, where President Carmen Del Valle, relentless in enforcing the rules, imposed fines without any room for discussion. Those meetings always had a solemn, almost dictatorial tone, where every word seemed to have been carved in stone. Upon arriving at the administrative building, a modern structure of glass and marble, I sensed that the tension was palpable. Some neighbors greeted me with looks of sympathy, others with a hint of suspicion. The atmosphere was oppressive, charged with the energy of those who felt crushed by arbitrary decisions. In the waiting room, I observed an elderly man sighing, with resignation, and a young woman anxiously poring over some papers in her hands. Everyone seemed to carry the burden of a system that had become inflexible. When my turn finally came, I was led into a small office on the top floor. There, Carmen Del Valle awaited me with a forced smile and a cold, calculating gaze. After a few formalities, she explained in a condescending tone that the HOA regulations clearly stated that the proliferation of non-native species which alter the homogeneous image of the neighborhood is grounds for a penalty. I tried to reason, explaining that my plants had been carefully selected for their rarity and beauty, and that many of the specimens were the result of research and conservation efforts. But Carmen, unyielding, insisted that there could be no exceptions, and that the fine had to be paid. I left that office feeling humiliated and furious. Injustice burned within me, and I could not understand how creativity and diversity could be penalized in the name of an order that, in reality, oppressed individuality. On my way back home, my mind raced with questions. What kind of system governed Eternal Roses? Could it be that behind this facade of order lay a hidden network of interests that only benefited a select few? My instincts told me there was more, a secret well guarded behind the walls of that association. That night, as the neighborhood settled into the calm of darkness, I decided to review some old documents I had stored since purchasing my property. Among dusty papers and ancient contracts, I discovered something that left me utterly perplexed. It turned out that many years ago, when I was still a young entrepreneur in the real estate world, I had invested in eternal roses by acquiring several properties, one by one, through different companies and confidential agreements. What had initially been a shrewd, seemingly innocuous investment had gradually become the cornerstone of my fortune. With each transaction, unbeknownst to anyone, my network of properties had quietly grown until it reached an unsuspected scale. As I leafed through these documents, my mind began to piece together the puzzle. Could it be that, without even realizing it, I was the majority owner of Eternal Roses? That every fine and every decision made by the HOA, seemingly directed against me, was actually part of a conspiracy by certain board members to hide the truth? The revelation was overwhelming. Over the years, I had accumulated control of more than 70% of the neighborhood's homes, a fact that had been deliberately ignored by the board, whose objective was to maintain power in the hands of a few. I was, in essence, the true master of Eternal Roses. That night, with the echo of my discovery reverberating in my mind, I felt my indignation transform into determination. The fine for my exotic plants was nothing more than the straw that broke the camel's back of a systematic injustice. While the HOA sought to impose a rigid, monochromatic order, I was prepared to prove that true beauty lay in diversity and freedom of expression, both in nature and in our community life. The next day, I returned to my home office. Facing a large, oak table, I spread out all the documents and contracts I had collected over the years. With meticulous precision, I began to draw up a timeline, connecting each acquisition and financial movement. The paper soon filled with notes, figures, and dates that confirmed my suspicion. I was not merely another homeowner. I was, in essence, the economic engine and the true owner of Eternal Roses. As I wrote, I recalled how, at every HOA meeting, President Carmen had dictated rules without listening to the voices of the residents. Those who dared to question her authority were silenced with exorbitant fines and threatening warnings. The majority resigned themselves to living in an oppressive environment, where creativity was punished and diversity suppressed. Was it not ironic that a man like me, dedicated to conservation and botanical diversity, was now being targeted with an absurd fine? That afternoon, I decided to convene a secret meeting with some neighbors who had long expressed their discontent with the HOA's management. We gathered in the spacious living room of an old house, away from prying eyes. There, amid murmurs and hushed voices, I shared my findings. Faces lit up as they realized that behind the imposed rules lay a corrupt system that favored a select few while ignoring the interests of the majority. One by one, the neighbors recounted their own stories. Fines for trivial infractions that would never have been penalized in any other community. Baseless warnings and arbitrary decisions that had damaged the harmony and conviviality of our home. Doña Maria, an elderly neighbor who had been fined for planting a few wildflowers in her garden, under the pretext that they clashed with the traditional style, told her story with a trembling yet determined voice. Jorge, a young entrepreneur, mentioned that his small urban garden had been dismantled simply for daring to defy the strict norms of the association. The stories accumulated, and with each tale, the tension and indignation grew. No one could have imagined that these shared grievances would soon spark a revolution. At the end of that emotional meeting, amid tears and approving applause, I took the floor and proposed a radical solution: to use my position as the true majority, owner of the neighborhood, to take control of the HOA and end the tyranny. Although the idea was bold, it resonated deeply with those neighbors who had long suffered. With a renewed spirit of resistance, we agreed that the next official HOA meeting would be the stage on which the truth would be exposed. Each of us pledged to bring evidence, documents, and testimonials that would unveil the abuse of power that had taken root. The night before the meeting, My mind was awash with strategies and scenarios. I meticulously reviewed every contract and financial record, preparing a presentation that would leave no room for doubt. That meeting, scheduled for the following noon in the main hall of Eternal Roses, was to be the climax of a battle aimed at liberating our neighborhood from oppressive control. The day of the meeting dawned overcast, with a wind that seemed to herald change. As I entered the hall, I noticed that the atmosphere was charged with tension. The board members, led by the unyielding Carmen del Valle, exuded arrogance and confidence, convinced that their decisions would remain unchallenged. In contrast, the neighbors were scattered in small clusters, exchanging knowing glances and silent nods of anticipation. When Carmen took the floor to commence the session, her voice echoed across the spacious room, though it could not hide the unease that permeated the air. In an official tone, she announced a series of new measures that supposedly would improve the neighborhood's aesthetics, among them the elimination of incongruous elements in gardens and facades. It was at that precise moment that I rose, and with a firm and steady voice interrupted. Before we continue, I must make a declaration that will change our perspective on the administration of this neighborhood. The room fell silent. Every eye was fixed on me, and for an instant, time itself seemed to pause. Calmly, I opened my briefcase and began presenting a series of documents and proofs that I had painstakingly gathered over the years. Among them, I revealed copies of property purchase contracts, financial statements, and transaction records that demonstrated, unequivocally, that I was the majority owner of Eternal Roses. The evidence was indisputable. Through strategic and entirely legal acquisitions, I had come to own more than 70% of the neighborhood's homes. Expressions of disbelief among the assembled residents soon transformed into astonishment, and, for some, anger. Carmen del Valle tried to regain control, stammering excuses and accusations, but the avalanche of evidence silenced her objections. The neighbors, who for so long had passively accepted arbitrary decisions, began to raise their voices. Accusations of unjust fines, abusive inspections, and a system designed to suppress any hint of individuality rang out louder than ever before. The hall became a stage for confrontation. Maria, the neighbor who had been fined for her wildflowers, stood up and recounted her experience in a quavering yet resolute voice, while Jorge and others corroborated their own stories. The documents I presented revealed that every fine, every sanction, had been used to finance projects that benefited only the board, while the true needs of the community were ignored. Today, in this very hall, I declare that the era of oppression and arbitrariness is over, I announced with conviction, feeling the weight of truth behind every word. My garden, bursting with exotic plants and teeming with life, reflects what this neighborhood can truly be: diverse, vibrant, and full of possibilities. We will no longer allow outdated rules and authoritarian mandates to dictate our destiny. The climax of the meeting came when, faced with overwhelming evidence and a crowd clamoring for justice, the board was unanimously voted out. With tears of helplessness in her eyes, Carmen del Valle was forced to resign, while the room erupted in cheers and applause, a collective exultation at the liberation of our community. The transformation of Eternal Roses had begun in that very moment. In the days that followed, a new order took shape. With my support and that of the majority of residents, transparent elections were held to form a new HOA, a board composed of representatives chosen democratically by the community. The oppressive regulations were reviewed and repealed, and initiatives promoting diversity and inclusion were implemented. The neighborhood, once a stage for repression and control, transformed into an example of coexistence and freedom. My garden, once the pretext for an absurd fine, became the symbol of this new era. No longer were exotic plants seen as a chaotic nuisance. Instead, they were celebrated as manifestations of creativity and natural beauty. Neighbors of all ages gathered around it to exchange botanical knowledge, share rare species, and enjoy a space that represented the union and resistance against tyranny. News of the uprising in Eternal Roses spread quickly through local media, soon becoming an inspiring example for other communities suffering under the thumb of corrupt boards. Forums, workshops, and conferences were organized where issues of transparency, civic participation, and the right to diversity were discussed. I, Rafael Morales, found myself emerging as an inadvertent spokesperson for a movement that transcended a mere dispute over a fine. It was a fight for dignity, justice, and the right to express oneself freely. Every afternoon, as I strolled through the revitalized streets of our neighborhood, I noticed the palpable difference. The facades, once uniform and monotonous, now burst with colors and textures. Gardens flourished with both native and exotic species, and an air of optimism replaced the old distrust. The former apprehensions gave way to a sense of community and solidarity, and our meetings evolved into spaces of dialogue and collective decision-making. As time passed, the impact of that historic uprising became evident in every facet of life in Eternal Roses. Quality of life improved significantly, and projects were launched to revitalize common areas, create urban gardens, and install playgrounds for children. A community once shaped by fear and submission was reborn with a vibrant, participatory spirit. Yet, despite the triumph, the battle was not without challenges. Some former board members covertly attempted to obstruct the changes, seeking revenge against those who had dared to challenge their authority. Rumors spread, and isolated actions were taken to try and restore the old order. However, the strength of the new community, anchored in transparency and active citizen engagement, proved unbreakable. Every attempted act of sabotage was swiftly detected and countered by a vigilant network of residents determined never again to succumb to authoritarianism. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in my study, I received an unexpected call from Manuel, one of my oldest friends who had been part of that crucial first meeting. With an excited tone, he said, "Rafa, something incredible happened today. As I was walking down the street, I encountered a group of young people organizing a cultural and nature festival in the Central Park. They said they were inspired by what we did, by the way we transformed our neighborhood. They want Eternal Roses to be a symbol of resistance and the beauty of diversity." That call filled me with pride and satisfaction. What had begun as a fine for excess exotic plants had ignited a revolution, a transformation that would resonate for generations. Over time, my role in the community evolved. I ceased to be merely the owner of an exotic garden and emerged as a true leader, one who inspired others to stand up for their rights and celebrate diversity in all its forms. The conferences and workshops we organized multiplied, and every meeting became an opportunity to share knowledge, experiences, and, above all, to strengthen the social fabric of our neighborhood. The story of Eternal Roses became emblematic of how a single act of rebellion against an unjust rule can transform the reality of an entire community. The lesson was clear. True beauty lies in diversity. And when people unite to defend their beliefs, no arbitrary power can stand in the way of justice. Today, as I gaze upon the splendor of my garden, filled with species from every corner of the world, I remember that absurd fine which sparked a revolutionary change. The plants, with their vibrant hues and intoxicating fragrances, stand as a living testament that freedom and creativity cannot be confined within pre-established molds. Every leaf, every blossom, is a reminder of the struggle for identity and authenticity in a world that too often seeks to homogenize diversity. In Eternal Roses, no longer are fines imposed for beauty. Rather, the community now celebrates the natural and cultural richness of every home. The transformation of the neighborhood established a new paradigm, one where active participation and transparency became the norm. And so, in every corner of our community, the story of a man who, with passion and determination, turned injustice into the seed of revolution continues to echo. This is the tale of the Garden of Revelations, a story of struggle, discovery, and, above all, hope. For when the value of every individual is recognized and diversity is embraced, no power in the world can extinguish the light that burns within a united community.